Stay still, all right, he said softly, his voice trembling faintly near my ear. I felt a large, soft hand, slightly unsteady, placed on my bare back. The unexpected touch sent a shiver through my entire body. My heart raced, and my breathing grew shallow and quick. I tried to maintain my composure to avoid an awkward moment for both of us. Despite my attempts to breathe steadily, my face was already flushed with heat. This was the first time my stepson had done something like this for me. It stuck, he murmured awkwardly. Just try a little harder, I suggested, striving to sound calm, though my heart was pounding as if it might leap out of my heaving chest. My name is Ella, 28 years old, a woman who once believed she had found complete happiness when I married Richard. He was a successful businessman, 20 years my senior, exuding confidence and maturity that captivated me from the very first meeting. He not only provided me with a life of abundance, but also a sense of security I had always longed for. But life in this house wasn't just about Richard. There was Baron, his son from his first marriage. At 21, Baron was a strikingly handsome young man with piercing eyes, but a reserved demeanor that sometimes made him hard to approach. He wasn't hostile toward me, but there was always a subtle distance between us, a gap not overtly defined but undeniably present. The house Richard had built for his family was a sprawling mansion in the suburbs, beautiful but often cold, especially since Richard was frequently away on business. On those days, it was just me, Baron, and the cavernous, empty rooms that seemed to swallow time whole. That evening, I received an invitation to attend an elite party, an important event Richard insisted I attend in his place to maintain his reputation. I wasn't accustomed to such lavish gatherings, but I understood it was my responsibility as his wife. I stood in front of the mirror in our grand master bedroom. The wardrobe doors were wide open, and 3 evening gowns were laid out on the bed. I tried on each one, but the more I tried, the more indecisive I became. The blue dress was stunning but felt overly extravagant. The black dress was elegant yet seemed too subdued. Finally, I settled on the red dress with its sophisticated back cut, though I hesitated, wondering if it was too daring. After a long moment of questioning myself in the mirror, I realized I couldn't make the decision alone. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I asked Baron for help. Baron, could I ask for your help with something? I called from the bedroom, my voice trembling slightly as though afraid to break the silence of the house. Within moments, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. Baron appeared at the door, his face calm yet his eyes filled with curiosity. He wore a simple white t-shirt and jeans, an effortlessly casual outfit that somehow accentuated his youthful, athletic presence. "What is it, Ms. Ella?" he asked, his tone steady but tinged with a hint of surprise as he noticed me standing in the middle of the room, half-dressed in a striking red gown with the back zipper undone. I'm having some trouble with this dress," I explained, glancing over my shoulder at the mirror. "The zipper is stuck. I can't reach it. Would you mind helping me pull it up?" Baron's expression flickered with momentary hesitation. He seemed to weigh his options, then nodded. "Sure. Let me try." I turned my back to him, holding the top of the dress tightly to maintain a semblance of modesty. Baron stepped closer, his hands slightly fumbling as he grasped the zipper. "Just stay still, okay?" he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. I felt his large, soft hands trembling slightly against my bare back. The unexpected contact sent a shiver through me. My heart raced, and my breathing quickened. I fought to remain composed, hoping to prevent any awkwardness. Yet, despite my efforts to stay calm, my face burned with heat. This was the first time my stepson had done something like this for me. Baron tugged at the zipper, but the dress seemed stubborn. "It stuck," he mumbled, his tone uneasy. "Try a little harder," I suggested, striving to keep my voice steady, though my chest rose and fell with the erratic rhythm of my pounding heart. Baron took a deep breath and applied more force. Instead of the zipper sliding up, a sharp ripping sound pierced the air. "Rip!" The red dress tore open at the back, the stitches unraveling like a wound. I barely registered what had happened before the cool air hit my exposed skin, leaving me frozen in place. "Oh no!" I gasped, my voice barely audible as the dress slid off, pooling in a heap of fabric at my feet. The room fell into a stunned silence. I stood there in nothing but nude-colored lingerie, my reflection glaring back at me from the full-length mirror. Baron stood motionless, his eyes wide with shock, his face flushing red. He raised his hands instinctively, as if to shield his eyes, but it was too late. "Ms. Ella, he stammered, stepping back awkwardly. I scrambled to grab the dress, but it was beyond saving, its once elegant form now a ruined mess. I managed to pull it up just enough to cover myself, my entire body flushed with heat, my palms damp with sweat. I was on the verge of crying out in frustration, but Baron moved quickly, placing a hand over my mouth and whispering urgently, "Ms. Ella, what are you doing? Do you want anyone to get the wrong idea?" I froze. His gaze was a mix of embarrassment and concern, tinged with an unexpected seriousness. My rapid breaths brushed against his hand, amplifying the tension in the air. Let go," I mumbled, my voice muffled under his palm. Baron released me instantly, stepping back as we stood there, facing each other in uneasy silence. The room was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Baron finally said, breaking the silence. His eyes darted away, as though afraid of how I might interpret the situation. It's okay," I replied, my voice shaky and unconvincing. The awkwardness between us was palpable, like two people who had unknowingly crossed an invisible line. I bent down to pick up the torn dress, my head low with embarrassment. Yet, as I gathered the fabric, a strange, indescribable feeling crept in, a feeling I couldn't ignore. Had I gone too far? Or had the situation itself crossed boundaries I hadn't even realized existed? Do you think a moment like this could change everything? I never imagined I'd find myself in such a situation, my heart racing and my mind flooded with chaotic thoughts. Had I done something wrong? Or was this merely a chain of unintended events? If it were you, what would you do? Run away from those feelings or face them head-on? I'm not sure I even want to know the answer. Looking back on that moment, I can't help but wonder if it was the beginning of everything. A silent shift, subtle yet powerful enough to ensure that nothing would ever be the same. After that evening, Baron changed. I couldn't ignore the way his gaze lingered on me more often than before, like a gentle breeze weaving its way through the cracks, quiet but persistent. He watched me during meals, when I quietly tended to the garden, or while I sat by the window with a half-read book resting in my lap. He never said much, but his presence seemed to fill the empty silence of the vast house, making it feel less hollow and more alive. As for me, I couldn't deny that I had started noticing Baron more as well. The small things he did, clearing the table when I was too tired, fixing the kitchen chair I'd thought was beyond repair, made me feel cared for in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Not from Richard, at least. But that realization only left me more confused. Was I reading too much into his actions? Or was something truly shifting between us? One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, I sat on the wooden chair outside on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was ablaze, with fiery orange hues, stretching out like a soft, endless canvas. But despite the breathtaking view, I couldn't find peace. My thoughts were chaotic, swirling like a melancholic melody that refused to end. Suddenly, Baron appeared, carrying a steaming cup of tea. The wisps of vapor curled into the cool evening air, blending with the fading light. "You look tired," he said, his voice low and soothing, almost like a whisper. I took the cup from him, feeling its warmth seep into my cold hands. "It's nothing," I replied, forcing a smile. "I just miss Richard." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't the whole truth. Baron sat down beside me, close enough that I could hear his steady, measured breaths. The silence that enveloped us this time wasn't cold or distant. It carried an unspoken understanding, as if he could sense all the things I was too afraid to say. "Are you happy?" Baron asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. It was gentle, yet the question struck like a lightning bolt, sinking deep into my mind. I froze. Happy? That simple question left me more unsettled than I could admit. Was I truly happy? I had a successful husband, a life of comfort and privilege, everything a woman could want. But was it enough? Why did my heart feel so hollow every time I walked through those cold, empty rooms that should have been filled with laughter? I think I have everything a woman could need, I answered. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. I stared down at the tea in my hands, avoiding Baron's gaze, afraid he might see the truth I was trying to hide. But you still feel like something's missing, don't you? He said, his tone not accusatory but strangely certain, as if he'd already unraveled the secrets I thought I'd buried so deeply. I looked up at him, his eyes serious yet gentle, as though urging me to confront what I'd been running from. In that moment, I felt like a small boat caught in the middle of a storm, buffeted by conflicting emotions, fears, and desires I dared not name. What would you do if someone saw through the loneliness you'd spent so long concealing? Would you turn away and retreat, or let yourself be drawn into the empathy they offered? I knew I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. Yet even with that knowledge, why couldn't I bring myself to walk away? In the days following that conversation, I felt the bond between Baron and me grow stronger. Something had shifted, unspoken, yet palpable in every shared moment. It lingered in the way he looked at me as I walked across the room, in the small gestures of help he offered without being asked. That invisible thread was tightening, pulling us closer in ways I hadn't anticipated. One morning, as I was pruning the rose bushes in the garden, Baron walked out with gardening gloves in hand. He didn't ask, he simply began helping. We worked side by side in a comfortable silence, but I couldn't help noticing the softness in his gaze, like the gentle warmth of early sunlight. You always take such good care of this garden, he said, breaking the stillness. I think without you, this house would feel so empty. I smiled, feeling my cheeks warm slightly. Thank you, but I think you're exaggerating. It's just a little work. No, it's not, he replied, looking directly at me. You make this place a real home. Those words, simple and sincere, made my heart skip a beat. I bent down to continue my task, but the feeling lingered, refusing to fade. In the evenings, we often cooked together. The laughter echoing through the kitchen seemed to erase the invisible walls between us. Baron would share little anecdotes, sometimes silly enough to make me burst out laughing. He'd watch me with a grin, as if my laughter was the sole purpose of his story. I knew I should keep my distance, yet those moments made me feel lighter, as if Baron saw me for who I truly was, not the perfect wife I worked so hard to project, but a real person. One evening, we were watching a movie in the living room. The room was quiet, the flickering light from the screen casting soft shadows across Baron's face. I tried to focus on the film, but I caught him glancing at me, as if he wanted to say something. Then, without warning, he reached over and took my hand. Startled, I turned to him. His eyes held a mixture of hesitation and resolve. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known, he said, his voice deep and filled with emotion. I pulled my hand away immediately, my heart pounding erratically. Baron, you shouldn't say things like that, I said, my voice trembling. I couldn't meet his eyes. Instead, I looked away, searching for a safe harbor, but there was none. But it's the truth, he interrupted, his tone firm yet earnest. I know this is wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you. I froze, feeling as though the air had been sucked out of the room. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to deny his words, to push him away, but another part, a quieter, unsettling part, recognized the sincerity in his gaze. And worse, I realized my own heart was wavering. I stood up abruptly, desperate to break the moment. Baron, don't say things like that again, I said, my voice unsteady. I don't want this to go any further. I hurried out of the room, leaving Baron alone on the sofa. But even as the door to my room clicked shut, I couldn't stop the torrent of thoughts racing through my mind. What had I done to let things come to this? Or was it my own unacknowledged vulnerability that had drawn me into this whirlwind? I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I put an end to this from the start? Why did I let it go so far? But you don't understand. Sometimes, a single look, a small, gentle gesture can pierce through the armor you've spent years building, reaching the most fragile parts of you. And when that happens, what would you do? Would you stop yourself, or let the current pull you along, even knowing it might lead to heartbreak? I remember that evening vividly. The soft glow of the chandelier in the living room cast a warm light, making the room feel cozier against the chill of the night. Baron and I were sitting on the sofa, talking about shared interests we hadn't realized we had: classic literature, old songs I thought only my generation cherished. Baron was in the middle of telling a funny story about his time in college when the shrill ring of the phone interrupted us, breaking the comfortable atmosphere between us. I glanced at the screen. It was Richard. My heart sank, and a wave of unease filled my chest. Taking a deep breath, I answered the call, forcing my voice to remain as calm as possible. "Hi, honey," I said softly. "I'm just watching TV." I could feel Baron's gaze fixed on me, his eyes darkening. He didn't say a word, but the slight furrow of his brow made me feel as though I were doing something wrong. Richard's voice on the other end was steady and calm, but there was an unfamiliar undertone to it. "Are you and Baron doing okay? I've noticed, you two seem closer lately. Should I be worried?" I nearly dropped the phone. His words struck like lightning on a clear day, jolting me out of my thoughts. I laughed, trying to keep my tone light and unaffected. "Don't be silly. Baron's always been a good kid." Richard chuckled faintly, but the brief pause that followed felt like an eternity. Finally, he wished me a good night and hung up. As I set the phone down, the air in the room grew heavy and stifling. Baron was staring at me, his gaze sharper than I had ever seen. "You're hiding this because you're afraid of him, aren't you?" he said, his voice low but firm, every word cutting straight through me. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. The silence between us stretched on, and the truth, unspoken but undeniable, hung in the air. Baron rose from the sofa, walking out of the room without another word. I sat there, feeling trapped between two worlds, one governed by what was right, the other by emotions I couldn't bring myself to admit. That day, the sky was clear, and the gentle sunlight bathed the backyard in a warm glow. Baron and I had decided to fix the fence, which had rotted after last week's heavy rain. He bent down, focused on sawing the wooden planks, while I sat nearby, picking up scattered splinters. We didn't talk much, but the synchronized rhythm of our work brought an oddly peaceful feeling. Suddenly, Mrs. Clara's shrill voice rang out from the other side of the fence. "Ella! With your husband away on a business trip, it's so admirable how close you and your stepson are." I looked up to see her leaning against the fence, her eyes alight with a curiosity that felt sharper than it should. I forced a light smile, trying to stay composed. "Yes, Baron's very helpful," I replied, my tone tinged with awkwardness. Mrs. Clara nodded, but her pointed gaze lingered longer than I liked. After a few more casual remarks, she wandered off, leaving Baron and me in an awkward silence. I turned to Baron, noticing his contemplative expression. "We need to be more careful," I said, breaking the quiet. "People might get the wrong idea." Baron set the saw down and stood up straight. His eyes met mine, more intense and serious than I'd ever seen them. "I don't care what people think," he said, his voice low but resolute. "But I want you to know. I can't stand seeing you as just my stepmother." His words cut through me like a blade, leaving a wound that hurt in ways I couldn't admit. I turned away, avoiding his gaze. "Baron, don't say that. It's not right." "But it's the truth," he said, stepping closer. "I can't pretend I don't feel this way anymore." I took a step back, the turmoil inside me growing unbearable. "Baron, we can't let this go any further," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to keep our distance, for everyone's sake." He didn't respond, just stood there, his eyes filled with emotions I didn't want to acknowledge. I quickly turned away and resumed my work, but my heart refused to settle. His words echoed in my mind, pulling me into a chasm I wasn't sure I could climb out of. There were moments when I asked myself, is this a nightmare? Or is it a test, meant to challenge my patience and loyalty? I didn't know. But I did know one thing, everything had changed from that moment, and there was no turning back. The memory of that afternoon is etched vividly in my mind. The crimson sunset filtered through the large glass windows, casting a warm golden hue over the living room, though it felt more like a warning of what was to come. Baron and I were sitting on the long sofa, an open book resting between us. The soft rustle of its pages seemed to mask the strange silence enveloping us. We were discussing a passage that delved into a character's psychological turmoil. Baron, with his eyes alight with passion, spoke animatedly about how the author captured emotions that were almost impossible to articulate. I looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, I saw someone entirely different. Baron was no longer a boy. He was a man, confident, vibrant, embodying a kind of energy I hadn't realized I'd been unconsciously yearning for. The sudden creak of the front door startled us. Richard stepped inside, his footsteps heavy against the wooden floor, drawing both our attention. He stood there, his familiar figure framed by the doorway, but his usual warmth was absent. His gaze swept over me before settling on Baron, sharp and probing. I shot to my feet, forcing a calm demeanor despite the pounding in my chest. "You're home early." "I thought your trip would last until the weekend," I said, keeping my tone as steady as I could manage. "I wanted to spend some time with you," Richard replied, his voice deep and composed, though it carried an unmistakable edge. His eyes flicked back to Baron, lingering as if trying to unravel a hidden truth. Dinner that night was heavy with silence. Richard barely spoke, his gaze flitting between me and Baron, scrutinizing every small interaction. When Baron excused himself to head upstairs, Richard reached out and grabbed my wrist. "Ella," he said, his tone soft but razor-sharp, "you and Baron seem closer than I realized." I froze, my mind racing for a response. "We were just talking," I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound composed. "You're overthinking it." Richard's eyes bore into mine, heavy with doubt. "I hope that's all it is. Don't give me a reason to question you further." I nodded weakly, but deep down, I knew his suspicion had already taken root. After that day, Richard began scrutinizing my every move with Baron. I tried to keep my distance, but Baron's gaze, piercing through every barrier I tried to build, left me feeling trapped in an inescapable whirlwind. Then came the fateful evening. The three of us sat at the dinner table, the oppressive silence weighing heavily in the air. Richard didn't say a word, but his eyes moved slowly between me and Baron, observing even the smallest gestures. Suddenly, Richard's phone buzzed. He picked it up, and I saw his expression change instantly. A wave of unease crashed over me, its intensity like a warning of the impending storm. Richard set his phone down on the table, his eyes cutting through me like ice. "Ella," he said, his voice cold and heavy. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" I tried to maintain my composure, but my hands began to tremble. "There's nothing going on between me and Baron," I said, my voice catching in my throat. Richard's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Is that so? Then explain this photo." He held up his phone. On the screen was a picture, Baron and I in the garden, standing closer than necessary. I immediately remembered the moment Baron had bent down to help me pick up something that had fallen on the grass. Mrs. Clara, the nosy neighbor with a penchant for meddling, must have snapped the photo and sent it to Richard. I froze. Any attempt at an explanation lodged itself in my throat. Richard stared at me, his eyes as sharp as a blade. "I hope this is just a misunderstanding," he said, his tone cold enough to chill the air around us. "Because if it's not, I won't forgive you." I couldn't answer. I sat there, paralyzed, as Richard stood and left the room. Alone at the table, I felt as though my entire world had collapsed. Every lie, every desperate attempt to hide the truth, had been laid bare. That was the moment I realized I was standing on the brink of ruin. Richard, the man who had given me everything, now looked at me like a stranger. And Baron, the one who made me feel alive, was also the source of my undoing. I wondered, could I have done things differently? Would anyone else in my position have made different choices? Or are we all just victims of emotions we cannot control? I remember that night vividly. Richard was still away on his long business trip, and the house was so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock with haunting clarity. The air outside was colder than usual, and I sat quietly on the sofa in my thin sweater, staring out the fogged-up window. I wasn't waiting for anything, not really. There was just an overwhelming emptiness, a quiet loneliness that had crept into my heart for longer than I cared to admit. Richard, my esteemed husband, always tried to give me the best of everything. But his love now felt like an exquisite ornament, beautiful to behold, but no longer meaningful in my everyday life. What I yearned for was something alive, something that could touch my heart in a way I hadn't felt in so long. When the door to the living room opened, I startled and turned. It was Baron. He was wearing a dark hoodie, his face tired yet tinged with concern as he looked at me. "Why are you still awake?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. "It's late." "I couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to hide the unease in my tone. "What about you?" Baron shrugged, stepping closer and settling into the chair across from me. "I heard you walking around. I couldn't rest, knowing you were awake." I smiled faintly, but it wasn't enough to lift the weight pressing on my heart. After a moment of silence, Baron broke it with a question. "Do you ever feel tired of always having to be strong?" I froze. His question wasn't direct, but it struck deep, peeling back layers I'd kept hidden. I lifted my eyes to meet his, and his gaze didn't waver, waiting patiently for an answer. My heart pounded, and I couldn't pretend his words hadn't shaken me. I began to deny it, but the truth was too clear to hide. "Maybe. But I don't have a choice, Baron. I have to be strong." Baron nodded slowly, his expression contemplative. "I get that. But sometimes, I think no one truly sees you. They only see the image you've worked so hard to maintain, not the real you." His words stopped me cold. How could someone so young, someone I thought I could easily shield myself from, see through everything I had tried to conceal, even from myself? "Not being seen, not being understood, it's one of the worst feelings," he continued, his voice soft but filled with profound empathy. I didn't respond. His words peeled away the mask I'd worn for so long. Yes, I craved to be seen, to be understood, to be loved for who I truly was. But what did that mean in this moment? I turned my face away, avoiding his gaze, but Baron didn't let me retreat. "Ella," he said, my name leaving his lips with both tenderness and resolve. "You don't have to carry all of this alone. I'm here. I want you to know you're not alone." His words felt like a lifeline, tangling my logic and emotions into an inextricable knot. I couldn't respond. Tears began to fall, and I felt smaller and more vulnerable than I ever had before. "You don't have to say anything now," he said, his gaze gentle and steady. "But if you ever want to share, I'll always be here." I looked up at him, into his eyes. They weren't just the eyes of a young man anymore, they were filled with sincerity, pain, and a fierce intensity I couldn't ignore. In them, I saw a reflection of myself, not as a perfect wife or a composed woman, but as someone fragile, vulnerable, and yearning for love. I wanted to turn away, but then he reached out and gently took my hand. That light touch, fleeting yet so resolute, set my remaining logic ablaze. "Baron, we can't," I whispered, though my words carried no conviction. "I don't care what happens," he said, his voice trembling. "I just want you to know you're not alone. I love you. I love you in a way I can't stop." My heart broke and swelled at once. I tried to pull away, but his hand held mine, not forcefully, but firmly enough that I could feel his determination. And before I could stop myself, I found myself leaning toward him. I'm not sure when the moment began. Maybe it was when our eyes met unintentionally, or when Baron stepped closer, one careful step at a time, as if any sudden move might shatter the fragile world we'd created. When our lips finally met, it wasn't rushed or careless, it was filled with raw, pent-up emotions. It wasn't the haste of desire, but the culmination of feelings long suppressed. In that kiss, every worry, fear, and boundary dissolved. I felt the gentleness in his every movement, the sincerity in the way his hand rested lightly on my shoulder, firm yet tender. Our breaths intertwined, warm and intimate, and I felt like I was melting into the moment. Richard, the rules, the consequences, none of it mattered then. In that instant, there was only me and Baron. He cupped my face, his fingers trembling slightly but steady. Ella, he whispered, my name breaking in his throat as if it were the only word he could say. His lips moved with a yearning purity, and I couldn't resist. I closed my eyes and let myself surrender to the flood of emotions. It was happiness, a happiness I never thought I could feel. I didn't know if I deserved it, but I knew I didn't want to let it go. When the kiss ended, I opened my eyes to see Baron looking at me, his gaze filled with a tenderness I'd never seen before. You're everything to me, he said, his voice trembling but his grip unwavering, as if afraid I might disappear. I didn't reply. I just stared back, feeling my heart beat in rhythm with his. That moment wasn't one of weakness or recklessness. It was love, pure and overwhelming, something I'd sought my entire life. The next morning, I woke up to find myself wrapped in a single blanket, Baron still asleep beside me. Panic washed over me as the memories of the previous night flooded back. No, this isn't right, I whispered, tears choking my voice. I'd let everything go too far. Baron woke, his face reflecting regret and resolve. He placed a hand gently on my shoulder, his voice low and sincere. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. I couldn't answer. Tears streamed down my face as I realized I'd crossed a line I never thought I would. I'd fallen for Baron, and this love, no matter how beautiful, would haunt me for the rest of my life. When faced with a crossroad, what would you do? I made my choice, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't have the strength to resist myself. But was this love worth losing everything? I don't know the answer. What I do know is that I'll never be the same person I was before that night. That night, the house felt suffocatingly quiet. The pale moonlight filtered through the trees, casting shadows over the garden paths, their eerie shapes filling the stone walkway. Baron and I stood in a secluded corner of the backyard, just beyond the reach of the light spilling from the grand house. A soft breeze carried the scent of grass and an icy chill that seemed to choke the air. You know, Baron broke the silence, his voice trembling as if burdened by words suppressed for far too long. You're the only one who makes me feel alive, like I matter. I froze, his words slicing through the fragile defenses I'd struggled to maintain. His gaze, both tender and intense, pierced through every boundary I tried to construct. I couldn't meet his eyes. Instead, I lowered my head, my hands trembling as they gripped the edges of my thin sweater. Baron, this has to stop, I whispered. I can't destroy this family. He let out a bitter laugh, the sound laced with pain. Family, he said, his voice dropping, anger creeping in. He's never cared about you. He always chooses his work, leaving you alone in this empty house. You don't deserve that. His words felt like a dagger, cutting deep into truths I had tried to deny. They were undeniable but unbearable to face. I felt trapped between two worlds, one dictated by duty, the other by emotions I could no longer suppress. Baron, stop, I whispered, but before I could say another word, heavy footsteps broke through the stillness behind us. Baron! Stop right now! Richard's voice roared, deep and sharp, like thunder ripping through the silent night. Baron and I turned simultaneously, both of us freezing in place. Richard stood there, bathed in faint moonlight, his familiar figure now overshadowed by an unbridled rage. His eyes burned with fury as they darted between me and Baron, finally landing on his son. "What are you doing?" Richard bellowed, his voice like a blade cutting through the tension. "She's my wife." Baron didn't flinch or back away. He held his head high, meeting his father's fiery gaze. "You don't understand her," he said firmly, his voice steady. "You don't make her happy." Baron's words were like gasoline thrown onto a roaring fire. I could feel Richard's anger escalating, each heartbeat pounding louder in my chest. Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly. "You're my son. How dare you do this?" Baron didn't waver. "I love her," he said, his voice unwavering. "And I won't apologize for it." That was the breaking point. Richard lost control, lunging forward and grabbing Baron by the collar, slamming him against the brick wall of the garden. "You have no right to love her. You will not destroy this family." "Stop it, Richard!" I screamed, rushing between them. My trembling hands clutched his arms, desperately trying to pull him away. "It's my fault. I'm the one to blame. Don't hurt Baron." Richard's grip loosened as his eyes shifted to me, his anger giving way to a deep, cutting pain. "Ella," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You betrayed me. How could you do this to me?" Tears streamed down my face, each one scalding my heart. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. "I'm sorry," I finally choked, my voice breaking. "But I can't deny how I feel." Richard stepped back, his eyes filled with bitterness and disappointment. He looked at us for what felt like an eternity, as though searing the moment into his memory. "Baron," he said, his voice now cold and steely, "get out of this house. Now." Baron opened his mouth to protest, but I shook my head, my tear-filled eyes pleading with him to stay silent. "Baron, please, just go," I said, my voice trembling uncontrollably. Baron's gaze softened, his anguish evident. "I'll go," he said quietly, his words barely audible. "But you need to know. I love you. And I'll never regret that." He turned and walked away, his figure fading into the shadows of the garden. I stood there, watching him leave, my heart shattering into pieces. What had I done? I had sacrificed everything for a love I couldn't control, and now I had to live with the consequences I had wrought. Richard walked back into the house without looking back. And I stood alone in the garden, tears streaming down my face, weighed down by a pain I knew would haunt me for the rest of my life. I stepped into the bedroom, my feet weighed down by the gravity of choices I couldn't face. Richard was sitting on the edge of the bed, his figure blending into the shadows that filled the room. His gaze was fixed out the window, no longer calm as it once was, but hollow and riddled with disappointment. "Richard," I called his name softly, my voice trembling as if afraid that every word might add to the suffocating heaviness in the air. "Don't," he interrupted, his voice deep and weary. He didn't turn to look at me. "I don't need to hear any excuses. The only thing I want to know is this: what will you choose?" I froze, my heart seeming to stop in that moment. The silence between us stretched like a bottomless chasm. Each passing second cut into me like a blade. I didn't want to hurt him, the man who had loved and protected me, but I also couldn't deny the intense emotions Baron had awakened in me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears choking my words. "But I can't go back." Richard let out a bitter laugh, one devoid of warmth, filled only with a profound ache. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes sharp as knives. "So, you've chosen him," he said, each word slicing through the air. "But he's my son." I couldn't respond. My throat closed up, and tears streamed down my face. I lowered my head, unable to meet his gaze. Then, like a fugitive fleeing her guilt, I turned and walked out of the room that had once been my safest haven. A light drizzle began to fall as we loaded the last of the bags into Baron's old car. I felt each raindrop on my skin, cold and stinging, like a reminder of the life I was leaving behind to step into a future I couldn't foresee. Buddy, the loyal family dog, stood under the porch roof, his sad eyes following our every move. He let out a quiet whimper and took a few steps toward Baron but stopped when he met my gaze. My heart clenched. It was as if Buddy understood everything, more than the people in that house ever could. From the porch, Richard stood motionless. He didn't speak, didn't call out to us, didn't try to stop us. His eyes, empty and distant, followed us like he was watching a scene that didn't belong to his own life. Baron opened the car door for me, but I hesitated before getting in. I turned to look at Richard, wanting to say something, a final apology, a thank you, or even just one last goodbye to etch him in my memory forever. But no words came. What I had done was too much, and words had lost their meaning. In the end, I turned away, stepping into the car. Baron started the engine, and the vehicle rolled forward, taking us away from the house that had once been my home. The rain began to fall harder, blurring everything behind us. Inside the car, Baron reached for my hand. His grip was warm, but all I could feel was the cold emptiness within me. "We'll start over," he said firmly. "Somewhere no one knows us. We can begin again." I didn't respond. My eyes stayed fixed on the window, watching as darkness and rain merged into one. The roads blurred past us, like a reel of forgotten memories. My heart was filled with emptiness and regret. I knew I had crossed every boundary, forsaken every value I once held dear. What do you think when you look back on the decisions you've made? Do you wonder if there was another path you could have taken? Was I blind, chasing an emotion that cost me everything? I loved Baron, that was a truth I couldn't deny. But what had that love cost me? A broken family, a deeply wounded man, and a guilt that would haunt me for the rest of my life. If it were you, what would you choose? Love? Responsibility? Or the silent sacrifice of your own desires? I wasn't brave enough to hold on to what I had, but do I have the strength to live with what I've chosen? That question lingers, unanswered, in the silence of my heart, every single day. We left everything behind, carrying with us a suitcase filled with painful memories and fragile hope. Baron and I chose a small town nestled among endless green fields, a place where no one knew who we were, a place where we could start anew. At least, that's what I told myself. The house we rented was modest, just 2 small rooms with faded walls and a tiny garden in the back. Baron found a low-paying job at a nearby auto repair shop. He came home every night with grease-stained clothes and a determined smile, trying to project optimism. I stayed at home, keeping busy with chores and tending to a small vegetable garden I'd planted to pass the time. At first, everything seemed peaceful. We cooked together, ate dinner by candlelight, and dreamed of a future free from judgmental stares and malicious whispers. But soon, the cracks in our new life began to show. When I walked through the park, I'd see older couples holding hands, their faces radiating a quiet contentment earned over decades of companionship. Children ran about, their laughter ringing through the air, their cries of "Mommy," "Daddy," piercing my heart like a blade. I knew what I had traded away, stability, respect, and the comfort of a normal life, for this love. And yet, I couldn't help but ask myself if it was worth it. Late at night, while Baron slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, searching for answers in the silence. But all I found was a void as vast and empty as the feelings gnawing at my soul. Rumors about us began to spread, even in this remote town. I couldn't fathom how they had reached us, but people always find ways to twist and tear apart stories they don't understand, or perhaps, don't want to understand. Undoubtedly, Mrs. Clara, the nosy neighbor from our old neighborhood, had sparked the fire. The whispers spread like wildfire in a dry wind. One afternoon, as I walked into the local grocery store, the weight of every gaze bore down on me. I heard the murmurs behind me, though they were meant to be quiet. "That's her. The woman who left her husband for his son. My head bowed low, my hands trembling as I fumbled to pay for a few simple groceries, vegetables, and bread. My heart felt like it was being crushed under the weight of humiliation. When I stepped outside, I felt as though I had just escaped a trial where I wasn't even allowed to defend myself. For the first time, I wanted to turn back, to face the whispers, to tell them the truth. But then I realized the truth wouldn't change anything. I had branded myself with my choices, and now, I had to live with them. One night, after Baron had fallen asleep, I opened my laptop and checked my email, a habit born of distraction rather than purpose. I wasn't expecting anything, but when I saw the sender's name, my heart clenched. Richard. My hands trembled as I opened the email. The message was brief, but each word cut deeply into my soul. I cannot forgive you, but I also cannot stop loving you. Every day, I ask myself why the woman I trusted most chose to betray me in this way. I hope you find happiness, but I also hope you never forget what you've lost. My vision blurred as tears streamed down my cheeks, dripping onto the keyboard. Richard's words were a mirror reflecting every mistake, every choice, and every loss I had tried to bury. I wanted to reply. I wanted to tell him that I'd never forget what I'd lost, that I regretted it all, that I still loved him in some way. But I didn't. I sat there, clutching the laptop, my heart weighed down by a guilt I could never escape. The past has a way of clawing its way back into the present, like waves crashing relentlessly on a shore. I wondered, if I had chosen differently, would things have turned out better? Or was I just searching for justification for what could never be forgiven? I loved Baron, of that, I was certain. But this love wasn't the bed of roses I once imagined. It was a path strewn with thorns, cutting me with every step I took. What would you think if you were in my shoes? Could you accept this trade-off, or would it all feel like an unending series of mistakes? I don't know the answer. Perhaps I will carry this question with me forever, wrapped in the silence of my own heart. Years have passed since the day we left that house, leaving behind everything that had once been the foundation of my life. Baron and I lived quietly in a small town where people rarely asked about the past. We grew older together, and while our love never faded, each passing day left me with an emptiness that no amount of time could fill. Baron, now with silver streaks in his once dark hair, still held the same tender gaze that had once stolen my heart. He was always the one to do everything he could to make me happy, even at the cost of sacrificing much of his own life. Though he never said it aloud, I knew he, too, bore the weight of our love, the isolation, the rumors, and the pain it brought us both. That evening, like so many others, we sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The fading sunlight bathed the sky in hues of gold and orange, and the distant mountains seemed to dissolve into the coming night. The wind carried the scent of wild grass, evoking a sense of untamed peace. I stared at the scene, wondering if I had truly found the tranquility I once longed for. Baron broke the silence, his voice soft yet filled with a weight I couldn't ignore. "Do you ever regret it?" I froze. It wasn't the first time he had asked me this, but something was different now. His tone carried no uncertainty, no insecurity. It was sincere, almost like he needed this answer to close a chapter. I stayed silent for a long moment, feeling every beat of my heart as though it were searching for the right words. Finally, I looked toward the horizon, my voice barely above a whisper, as if confessing to the world itself. Yes. I regret it. I felt Baron stiffen beside me, but he didn't interrupt. I regret breaking Richard's life, for making you endure isolation and criticism. I regret not being strong enough to choose the right path. I turned to face him, his eyes glistening under the fading light of the sunset. I smiled, a sad, bittersweet smile that mirrored the dying glow of the day. But if I had to do it all over again, I would still choose you. Tears streamed down my face, not from pain, but from the relief of finally saying what had lived inside me for so long. Baron wrapped his arms around me, holding me tightly, as if to shield me from the weight of my own confession. "I know you've sacrificed so much," he said, his voice steady yet raw with emotion. "But I've never stopped loving you, and I never will." We sat there, side by side, holding each other as the sky darkened into deep shades of purple. The stars began to appear, faint and distant, like tiny glimmers of hope in a vast, uncertain universe. I wondered, as I often did, whether this love was truly worth it. It had given me happiness I never knew existed, but it had also taken everything I once held dear. The wounds we had inflicted, on ourselves and others, would never fully heal. But this was the path we chose, a path from which there was no return. Have you ever thought about the choices in your life, the ones that change everything, not just for you, but for the people you love? I chose love, but it wasn't a fairy tale. It was a love cursed by circumstance, a love for which I sacrificed my very soul. Now, as I look into Baron's eyes, I wonder whether I was right or wrong. Perhaps I will spend the rest of my life torn between those two questions. But no matter what, I know one thing: I lived, not perfectly, not righteously, but truly lived. And perhaps, that's all any of us can hope for in this fleeting existence. As you hear my story, what will you think? Will you judge me, or will you try to understand? I don't expect your forgiveness, for I've never forgiven myself. But I hope you'll see that sometimes, love isn't a choice, it's a destiny.